So I'd like to welcome everybody to our Community of Learners session here with Dr. Paul Patton. And thrilled that Dr. Patton can join us virtually. My name is Tom Holsinger-Friesen. With some of my colleagues here, we help with the CPLA committee, Christian Perspectives on the Liberal Arts, and have a monthly time to talk about key topics. And we're thrilled to today talk about Dr. Patton and Dr. Robert Woods' new book, Everyday Sabbath. So I'd like to just share briefly about maybe an experience I had this morning where Paul is going to be talking about the world we live in and the challenges, the opportunities of technology. And for me, Paul, you might be glad that you escaped some of our Michigan snowfall. I woke up a little bit late and I didn't have time to shovel. I had an 8:55 class and I thought, well, I think I can just, slam the car in reverse and plow through the driveway, and that technology is going to get me to work on time. And then lo and behold, the snowplow comes through and leaves a nice pile. And I thought, okay, I'm going to take a Sabbath walk instead. So your book is so thought-provoking and on how, whether it's technology that lets us drive cars or talk to friends on the phone, or technology that stimulates the imagination and is, whether it's social media, whether it's music, art, TV, these things impact us and I think provide opportunities as well as challenges. So I thank you, Dr. Patton, for joining us. And I want to just—
my privilege.
If you don't know Paul Patton, what a wonderful, humble, wise man he is. Dr. Patton is Professor Emeritus here at Spring Arbor University, taught in the communication department for many years. I believe you're also a Spring Arbor University.
Absolutely. Graduate in 1974. And I must say, Tom, that the guy that changed my life and recruited me as a baseball player, today is the anniversary of his passing. And I was able to put on Facebook a tribute saying that Coach Burbridge changed the direction of my life. And I'm very thankful for his confidence and his big levels of patience with me.
Yes. I can just say from my heart, you have been passing it on. We've had wonderful discussions. If you know Paul, you know that he's such an encourager, and I'm delighted that folks are joining us here, and more will watch the recording. So Dr. Patton also he is an ordained minister, trained counselor on the pastoral staff of Trinity Church in Metro Detroit, founded Trinity House Theater, and author of over 30 stage plays. Of course, you've got multiple books, and we're talking today about your new work with Dr. Robert Woods, also a Spring Arbor University professor, and your collaboration here.
And by the way, I should mention—
yeah, please.
That Robert Woods, a lot of you know him as a colleague for many years. He was the one that I was teaching at the oldest historically Black college in America, Hampton University. And he called me, he said, look, there's a theater opening. This was in late 2001, his first year there. And he had forgotten, I think, that I was an alumnus. And so the only reason I would have left Hampton, because I loved it so much, is that my alma mater called. And I should also mention to my colleagues at Spring Arbor, the institution that changed the direction of my life, as certainly initiated by Coach Burbridge. But Robert Woods has become one of the most prolific comm scholars in the country. And he just doesn't stop, man. So, and people that know him, his colleagues, will say, "Oh, that doesn't surprise me at all." So,
absolutely, and you two are a dynamic duo here in your new book. You know, our focus session, our focus conference that we do every year here at Spring Arbor is coming up March 21st to 23rd, and it's on the topic of crossroads. So I think in every discipline, we can consider those moments in time where we've got this history to reflect on, see where we've come, learn from our mistakes, hopefully build on the successes, but also recognize there's a future and we've got choices in the matter and which direction to take. So with what you're doing, Paul, and you've taught a course here at Spring Arbor for a number of years on pop culture, social media, and how should we as Christians become more aware of how the culture is shaping us? How can we bring scripture, and you've done a lot of work on the prophets, for example, the Old Testament and others, and Christian teaching and Christian practices to bear. And so much of that wisdom is distilled in this book, which you can get at the White Library. Want to say that? So we will have some time for questions if you'd like to hold on to those or put them in the chat, either way. But I'm wondering, Paul, could you talk a little bit about what prompted you to write this book? What was going through your mind?
Okay, sure. And by the way, lest I forget it, I wanted to mention, because you were talking about technologies, communication technologies, transportation technologies, that change the way we commune, change the way we relate, change the way we dance as a metaphor. I'd like to remind people that Alexander Graham Bell, the inventor of the telephone in the 19th century, he could sense how this invention would change everything. In fact, in his Florida office, he would go to Florida every summer, evidently. He would not have his own invention in his office. Why? Because he could see that it was an interruption without an appointment. And so he was wise enough to recognize that. And, we're learning from, for instance, Marshall McLuhan. He was the first to present in a scholarly yet readable way that the technologies, inventions, change the way we commune, change the way we communicate, change even the way we worship, and certainly change the way that we interface with others. So it's just a reminder. So what started this? What started this for me is that as a young, I'll put it this way, and it was certainly long before I was a young pastor. I remembered carrying my transistor radio around, Chuck White, wanting to listen to the top 100 greatest hits of all time. And I remember going to a church softball practice, taking my transistor radio into center field because I wanted to hear every song choice. And, it consumed my imagination and my time over, that 2 to 3 hour period. But the story I like to tell is that I remember as a young pastor at Trinity Church, and I was ordained there in 1986, but this was before this, I was a youth pastor, but I was having to prepare a sermon. But the problem was the sermon was due on Sunday, and Saturday had college football games, and there could be 2 and 3 of them. And I, not to say that I had any team that I was significantly cheering for, but I was, it was a distraction. I was spending 6 to 9 hours watching football when I had a sermon to finish. I mean, 1 maybe, monitor and moderate, 1 maybe, but 3, and I
You're not alone though, Paul. Yeah, I think we can identify.
I have found those dilemmas. Why don't I have the strength and power and decisiveness to prioritize what's before me? And so, I didn't even have to get up because, I'm sure there were remotes then, and I could watch different football games in the 3 networks. And then I'd ask, what did I accomplish? What was why was it such a significant, major, dramatic question that postponed my more significant work? I could not prioritize. And since I started writing journals, and a lot of the dominant theme is this inability. What is it about pop culture that can so consume us to the point where we don't understand how our other responsibilities should be above these pop culture promptings? So that's what started.
Yeah, it reminds me of the old adage, if you want to know something about water, don't ask a fish. That I think what I love about your book is that you first help us become more aware of the culture that's shaping us. And it's too easy for us to kind of just sleepwalk through our world today. And I wonder if you might talk a little bit more about pop culture and how you would define it and what's involved, and are all the different elements equally powerful in shaping us, or your thoughts on that?
Yeah. But let me also mention before I get to that, is that I started teaching in pop culture. I was asked to teach it after Paul Nemechek left for his cross-cultural ministry with Bev. And I'm thinking, oh gosh, this is going to be a little threatening, because I have to follow up, such a academic lecturing star, Paul Nemechek. And so I got to teach that course, 10, 15 years. I can't remember how long I taught it, but I would take students, certainly they'd learn about the history of pop culture and definitions of pop culture, but they would also be involved in exercises that are in the book that would help them to understand and come to grips with their own potential addictive patterns with pop culture. So you take them to the exercises in the book, and there's a variety of them. And they would have an opportunity as students to, for instance, go without social media for a week. And by the way, the line of demarcation on social media is 2007. It's called Facebook. And when students would be without that for a week, this was near the last few years I taught it, some would report that their hands would be shaking without their fix. And 99.9% of the students, after going through this exercises at Spring Arbor, many of them raised in Christian churches, most of them involved in youth groups from their churches, 99.9% said, yep. After going through these exercises, we realized that we're addicted. And so the question is, what do I do? How do I transcend this? Shall we start some 12-step groups? I even had students ask me that. Intriguing. And of course, as with Bill W., who invented, the Christian man who invented the 12-step patterns, I found this to be the case with my students until they were assigned with, okay, do the work of being able to know your time spent and the money spent on your engagement with pop culture. They would always, as any alcoholic, as any drug addict, as any addict would do, in part of it is to handle their self-justification systems. They would minimize how much time and how much money they were spending on their addiction.
Right.
And so any emotional agitative trigger would cause them not to call on the sick, not to read their Bible, not to pray, but to check with their screens and see how many likes they got, and to binge and to scroll. These are the phrases that are so clearly associated with this mass media pop culture dance. But where do I want to start? The books that have helped me the most in contextualizing what's at stake here, one would be Neil Postman's Amusing Ourselves to Death.
Yeah. And
I remind my students that Roger Waters, who was the head of the 60s, 70s band Pink Floyd, read Postman's book, Amusing Ourselves to Death, was so freaked out, he created a third of his trilogy, a very famous trilogy from Pink Floyd and Roger Waters. The last, he wrote the record Amused to Death after reading Neil Postman's book, and I always recommend that to everyone. In fact, I was so freaked out by Neil Postman's book, Amusing Ourselves to Death, that I think came out 85, 86. That I memorized as an actor the preface. We were keeping our eye in 1984 when the year came and the prophecy didn't. Thoughtful Americans sang softly in praise of themselves. Wherever else the terrors had come, we here in America had escaped Orwellian nightmares. But we've forgotten that alongside Orwell's dark vision was another one, slightly older, slightly less well-known, equally chilling, Aldous Huxley's Brave New World. And Brave New World is something that I think that I want the book to prompt people to revisit, because you don't need a terrorizing big brother, because as Huxley would say, we've come to learn to love the technologies that undo our capacities to think. So that would be one of the first. But I had an opportunity to introduce, as an actor, Neil Postman to an audience. And after and the introduction was reciting his preface for the book. And he said, he said to the audience, I want to thank Paul first for reminding me that I'm a good writer. Neil Postman, whose son wrote a follow-up to the book that came out about 10 years ago. It was not called Amusing Ourselves to Death. It was called Amazing Ourselves to Death. And it's certainly worth. Another book that was,
yeah. I was just going to say that.
Go ahead.
That the Postman's book Technopoly, which I think your colleague Robert Woods put me on, really blew my mind. And the whole notion that inventors very rarely have an understanding of the implications or the power of the technology that they develop. And it only comes after time that we see, wow. So for example, I show in a class a video clip from a Verizon commercial from 2011 when smartphones were, getting super popular and we're all enthralled. And it showed this guy sitting in a corporate boardroom doing all this amazing stuff on his new Droid 2. And as he's going faster and faster, so productive, so efficient, his arm morphs into a robotic arm. And this ideal image that to be human means we're more machine-like, we're efficient, we're without boundary. And when I show my students that clip now, 11 years later, they're like, yeah, how silly that we didn't see some of the downside of that.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Other books or sources that
the other book, the contextualizing book is The Image, The Guide to Pseudo Events in America by Daniel Boorstin. And this was published about 1960, and he could see how we were becoming an imagistically driven culture and what were the price tags of that. And one of the things that he said was especially expensive is the raising of our expectations in terms of what life held, and he talked historically about the point in time when news was no longer gathering. It was news making. And for instance, one of the things that he describes in The Image, The Guide to Pseudo Events in America, Daniel Boorstin, is the fears of Kierkegaard before he died, of imagining, as he was in Europe, 10,000 people reading the same newspaper article, the same headline at the same time. He was foreshadowing, Boorstin connecting that with the horrors that Kierkegaard would experience as he's seen, 1 billion people watching the Academy Awards, paying attention to people that least need the attention, the celebrities that we're worshiping, but his description of extravagant expectations about what life holds and who I should be and the powers that I should have, and how technology should be able to deliver. We go to, as he said in his preface, you go to bed at night just knowing that news is going to be gathered for you to have presented, for you to be able to watch the next morning. And if there's not enough sufficient news, they'll make it.
For our consumption.
And then of course, another book that contextualizes our book to me, and that was so influential in my life, and I pushed on my students, was Christopher Lasch's Culture of Narcissism, which I think came out around 1978. It had such an impact on an academic and general cultural community. Jimmy Carter, President Carter at the time, read it and was so moved by it. He invited Christopher Lasch, who I believe was a professor at University of Rochester, to come and talk to me, the President of the United States, about the implications and how do we address these. The propensity of the culture and the advertising system and the entertainment systems creating a greenhouse of narcissism, which is, practically defined excessive and exclusive self-love. Let me also say, because I just thought of this, I remembered learning what narcissism, a quick definition of narcissism, excessive and exclusive self-love. In the book, when we talk about one of the antidotes to our pop culture addictions, is cultivating sacred interiority, which includes what a program I call stewarding the stirrings of the soul. I have been memorizing a verse a day since 1993. And part of it was, that's when I left the ministry, formal pastoral ministry, and was doing some graduate training in theater and communication at Regent University. And I said, look, I'm no longer getting paid for writing and preaching B- sermons. But I want to stay involved in the text. I want to stay involved in the text. And so I started memorizing a verse then, and I remembered a verse a day then, 1993. I remembered I lived in Virginia Beach, walking through the neighborhood, reciting scriptures that I had memorized. And by the way, this is an emphasis that's in two of the chapters in Everyday Sabbath. And I remembered, even though I had preached through the book of First Peter, okay, here I am trying to recite it as I'm walking along. And I remembered coming across a phrase in First Peter. I can't remember which one it was. It so struck me. I had to stop walking, and I sat on the curb with my head in my hands. That had never happened to me in terms of sermon preparation, but in the recall and the recitation was very, very, very powerful. But I say that to say this: what I say to my students, and we say this in the book, when you come across a definition, a theological, philosophic definition that speaks to you, and especially if it's short and memorizable, spend the time to memorize it. I say to students, I say to audiences. And once you do, and you keep practicing being able to retrieve it and recite it, you will use it extemporaneously 500, 1,000 times for the rest of your life. The glory of God. What is glory in the scriptures? One working definition is the impact of God's presence. I find in talking with students and talking with people, that definition comes up all the time. And I'm saying to people, there are things worth memorizing so that you can retrieve them on command as circumstances invite you to redeem it. Abraham Joshua Heschel said, I'm forgetting, I'll remember it.
It's okay. I do just want to say that I run across alums of Spring Arbor, and this is part of your legacy, your encouragement for folks to do the work to preserve those pearls to love scripture and to memorize. So
Yeah,
it's
exactly. Well, this is from Abraham Joshua Heschel. Inspiration passes. Having been inspired never passes. In other words, if I can retrieve that inspirational moment and not let it slip away, what was it that moved me? What was it that inspired me? If I can retrieve that on command as circumstances invite me to redeem it, I have an oasis of the mind whenever I need it. What's worth memorizing? And in fact, part of the arrogance of the culture, the arrogance of literacy, is you don't have to memorize anything. Why?
yes,
Because you can look it up.
yeah,
But it's
exactly.
always 7 seconds too late. What's
And
worth retrieving? What's worth
there,
memorizing? What's worth stewarding the souls? And by the way, Tom, I say to audiences and I say to my students, look at one of the ways to stay existentially alive. And this is part of the category cultivating sacred interiority. What do you think about when you have nothing to think about, which is a dilemma of many of our students because they're not memorizing anything. They might memorize it for a test, but then they self-congratulatory say to themselves, I don't have to keep remembering it. And I say to students, look at, you're going to be tested. The real test is 20 years from now. Can you retrieve what you think is important from what you've taken from this class? But inspiration passes. Having been inspired never passes. If I can retrieve it on command as circumstances invite me to redeem it, I have an oasis of the mind whenever I need it.
Wow, that's powerful. And I'm remembering Nicholas Carr in his book, The Shallows. He talks about how these technologies, whether we think about Google or whatever it is, that he calls them, technologies of forgetfulness. They really push us in the other direction. Like you said, I don't need to remember that because I can look it up. And I guess maybe that leads me to my next question, which is, okay, we are realizing that we're living in a culture that has changed so much, the impact of social media, pop culture, pushing us away from cultivating some of these virtues. Is it an option to just, and Rod Dreher talks about the Benedict option, which is kind of, let's sequester ourselves, let's withdraw from culture and let all this madness pass. Now, I believe in the book, you, just to quote you there, you say that we cannot not dance with pop culture. So it's a fascinating analogy, if you don't mind unpacking what you mean by dancing, and then, what you think. Is it possible to withdraw from that, or what's the solution that you're identifying here?
Let me first off mention the metaphor of dancing. What we mean here is that the media, the engagement, the art, shall we say, sometimes with our students, the pornography that they're dancing with. It's a dance partner that can sometimes take them into dance halls that are sacred and elevating and wise, but also take them into dance halls that are foolish and profane and inhumane and sinful. But it's hard to say no when that dance partner is leading us stimulatingly, engagingly, and sometimes we are so engaged that we are in a trance, not even knowing when that dance partner of pop culture and mass media and the technologies is stepping on our feet, is kicking us in the shin, is spitting in our face, and so part of it with students, and some of the most intense cases are students who have come and confessed that they were addicted to pornography. And on that point, let me just say that my brother, who gave me permission to talk about this, who passed away a year ago, he started his pornographic addiction being pressed by magazines being pushed under his Ormston floor door, because people like to tease him because he was a new exuberant Christian, somewhat innocent. But for him to feed his addiction, he had to go to the pornography stores. He had to pick up a magazine. He had to drive his car, and he had to go to a clerk and present the magazines and buy them. Okay. He left his addiction after 10 years, decades before the pornographic addict. Now all they have to do is press a button. All they have to do, and they have pictures, stimulus galore. All that to say is, I think one of the principles of Christ here, we forget sometimes in the struggle as we are trying to learn how to monitor and moderate our dance with pop culture. Jesus said, if your right eye causes you to sin, pluck the thing out. It's better for you to live without one, with one eye, one part of your body, than for you to be tormented with the torments of Gehenna, right? Sometimes students and their professors, we don't know ourselves well enough to know when our eye is causing us to sin, when our foot is causing us to sin. How to help monitor and moderate to the place where they know their dance engagement enough to know that this is an addiction, this is counterproductive, this is sinful, I need to cut it out of my life. I've seen that happen, but it's not something that's charted and shall we say monitored well. And sometimes this is related to our self-justifying arrogance, but that would be something that I think that the book doesn't prompt as much as probably in retrospect I wish it would, and maybe in the follow-up I'll talk about. How do you decide when you can't even when you have to drop out of Facebook because you're so addicted to the number of likes you get for your self-posing, when your quote doesn't get the 17 likes that somebody else's did. So being able to help students identify and help audiences and help ourselves identify when we need to say no to something and cut it completely out of our lives. For instance, Augustine, in his Confessions, and by the way, I have a mini commentary on some of the pop culture related links to Augustine's Confession. He describes, and of course he wrote the Confessions at the end of the 4th century, beginning of the 5th. Took him several years, and it was probably about 10 years after he was converted. But he would go to the theater, to the Roman theater, or wherever he lived. He would go to the theater, and of course in Rome at the time, in contrast to Athens, the producers of these plays would say, "Look at how do we get the most people here?" And they would do some inhumane, incredibly profane stuff. They would do some brilliant stuff too, but Augustine says years later, I can't get out of my mind things that I saw in the Roman theater that I wish I could. I can't erase them. But he would go, because he had to walk several blocks to the theater, a few times a week at most, if he had that kind of discretionary time. This is in contrast to people that you meet now that are watching, and I've talked to them, 3 and 4 movies a day, who are binging, who are scrolling for hours, looking for something. And don't know what they when they see it, but they're looking. It's as if they have nothing else to do.
And there's a recent book that was published. I forget the title, something to do with bored, angry, something, and stupid. And so, it's not a Christian book, but it's recognizing, wow, boredom and how technologies have been created to solve us of that problem, so to speak, but really opening the door to all sorts of other traps. And I think maybe my next question gets at where you see a solution or a path forward. And so Sabbath it's in the title here, Everyday
Yeah, yeah.
Sabbath. And I think that when we look at the Old Testament, one could say, well, the Sabbath is a part of the Levitical law and rules and regulations and do this and do that. But I know with your previous work and even with this one, you focus more on the prophets and connect the Sabbath with that. And so I'm wondering if you might talk a little bit about how you retrieved that key biblical concept, and how you see it as relevant for us as we face a pretty unstable, challenging time when it comes to pop culture.
Well, if I may, I think I'll respond initially to that by talking about, again, the second antidote, the first one being cultivating sacred intentionality. And how do you do that? The second one is cultivating sacred interiority. And one of the things we do is we talk about retrieving the Jewish habit of Shema, Hear, O Israel. And I find myself with Christian audiences and even with the secular audiences, they respond to this. What is a truth so comprehensive that's worth memorizing and worth saying the first thing you get up and the last thing before you go to sleep? It puts into context all of life, all of your responsibilities. And I'm asking students more and more, and people in churches, what's your Shema? And they're responding very well. What's worth memorizing and saying? It doesn't have to be like, the Jews. And again, I think the concept of Shema is one of the fulfillments of God's promise to Abraham that through your seed, the world would be blessed, obviously, ultimately fulfilled in the person and work of our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. But the idea of Shema, it seems to be unique to ancient Judaism. And to the Jewish practice of our time is saying a Shema, memorizing it. And of course, the most famous one was Deuteronomy 6:4-9, right? Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all of your heart. I'm asking audiences, what's your Shema? What's worth saying every day? And for Christian audiences, I say, look, you might want to change your Shema every year. In fact, to young married couples I work with, I say, look at your Shema is an easy choice. It's your vows. You memorize your vows. You say them 2 to 7 times a day. They contextualize all of life, including the temptations. Right.
And it does seem that even neuroscience today is showing the powerful impact of, something like what you're talking about, having something to frame our days and keeping that, just like the Old Testament talks about, keeping it in front of us, binding it to our forehead. So
Absolutely.
You're talking about biblical wisdom that is vindicated even in science, I think, to some extent.
Absolutely, absolutely. The Proverbs talk so much about juxtaposing wisdom and foolishness. The wise man keeps wisdom in front of him. The fool's eyes wander to the ends of the earth. I mean, what a description of the juxtaposition before us in this mass media dominated age. In fact, sometimes I've been asked, why is it that young people are less likely, it seems, to be dedicated to the church, even those at Spring Arbor? And I say, look, unlike any other generation in history, they have access to the same thing that, shall we say, Pyrrho, who was one of the adjutants of Alexander the Great. He went all over the empire. And what did he see? He saw that there were a variety of different competing religious presuppositions. They couldn't all be right. And so his conclusion was none of them can be. We have students that can go via their devices, via their laptops, to all over the world, stories all over the world with protagonists that don't agree with him presuppositionally, theologically, philosophically. And what's the natural conclusion if this is a tsunami of exposure to this kind of variety? They conclude, well, like Pyrrho did.
Yeah.
It can't all, there's so many contradictions. Nobody's right.
Kind of a throwing in the towel,
Yeah, exactly. We can't confidently assert any theological presuppositions, is what Pyrrho basically said.
Wow. Could you talk about, the notion of everyday Sabbath? And this is a friendly interview because I love your book and I love what you are presenting to us, but just a gentle pushback or your thoughts on, the notion that everyday Sabbath, if someone were to say, hey, if every day is Sabbath, if every day is equally holy, is anything holy? So how do you see bringing in the Sabbath and a new way of looking at life without kind of blandly making everything generic,
Well,
how do you live this out?
Yeah. I'll quote Heschel again here, and I think he's right here. Something sacred is at stake in every moment. An opportunity to affirm the image of God in every stranger. I mean, that is, there's no segmentation there. There's no division there. We are to be living for Christ moment for moment, recognizing the holiness of time moment for moment. As Heschel said, we must wake up in the morning with a view to the world that takes nothing for granted. Everything is a gift. We cannot live, as he said, emotionally neutral lives. For the root of all sin, he says, is indifference to the sublime grandeur of being. He's right. He's right. So I think who was it, the writer of Hebrews, and I'm trying to remember where, but the writer talks about how Israel coming into the promised land to experience essentially Sabbath all the time. Sabbath all the time. The devotional life that should be ours, and I talk about this in early in the book. Robert and I talk about this. That so oftentimes the default mode of people in our culture is the entertain me sensibility. Okay, the pop culture dance, and we talk about in the book about the importance of cultivating, being more cognizant of a variety of dances. And how do you get out of the habit of just having the pop culture dance be the dominant one? And that's where our students are. And we talk about it in the book. And again, this is in light of experiencing Sabbath every day, a ministry dance, a family friend dance, an athletic arts dance,
And
so how to cultivate those.
Right. And I am drawn, to John Wesley and his final words before he died. And best of all, God is with us.
God is with us.
This central claim belief that God's presence is not just limited to, the temple or a certain building or place.
Yeah, exactly.
Every moment, every place, God's presence fills his creation. And what if we had the eyes to see that and live accordingly? Yeah.
Let me get something.
Okay. And while Paul is getting that, I just also want to note that his book is full of practical points of application, so this is not just an academic exercise, but he'll talk about how to keep a pop culture journal and track our engagement with it, because I think the first step is to recognize, okay, what am I doing now and where are my blind spots? There are quotes interspersed that'll make you think. There are little boxes that have just gems of wisdom here. So I hope that you'll think about checking this book out of the library, buying it, and you know, I have no vested interest. I don't think Paul is concerned with royalties and all that, but just this notion that we struggle to find our way through sometimes, and this is a proposal worth checking out. So I was just talking, Paul, about just the practical wisdom you give here, whether it's keeping a pop culture journal. You know, where do we start? There's just concrete steps that we can take to become more aware. And you also have the three key concepts: sacred intentionality, sacred interiority, sacred identity. But, you know, we're kind of getting towards the end. So what do you want to leave us with? You know?
Sometimes I'm asked, what's the first place? Where do you start? And I say to people, keep a journal. Keep a journal. It can be an electronic one. It can be a manual one. I've been keeping a journal. And part of it is, as a playwright, as a writer, I have to steward my ideas, you know, steward the stirrings of my soul. But one of the things that was an exercise that worked with my students at Spring Arbor in the pop culture class is when you're engaged in, and when you're feeling drawn to binge or to be engaged in that second movie, or looking for some kind of momentary escape from any kind of emotional agitation, learn to identify, just as Adam identified the animals. You know, he made the gift of God of making comparisons and contrasts and creating categories and concepts. I mean, this is long before Francis Bacon, right? But I say to the students, identify what was it that is the self-justification for your engagement. Is it, and it's one of three things. If you say to yourself suddenly, I've earned this dance, this time with pop culture, this escape, this, you know, and again, we are made to rest and to experience art and story. And in fact, story structure is an invention of God, right?
You talk in the book, don't you, about how even more than music or art, story engages the whole brain in some way.
No question. But when we say to ourselves, I've earned this dance, I call it reward viewing. Somebody's worked hard all day, and so they come home and sit in front of the television or sit in front of their screen at the expense of the engagement with their children and with their marital partner or their neighbors or the people in need. And it's a reward viewing. I've earned this dance. And then there's, I need this dance, relief viewing. And I'm saying, you know, be able to find the honesty and the courage to be able to admit, what is the self-justification behind the binge, behind the scrolling that takes hours? Is it reward viewing? Is it relief viewing? And then oftentimes, and this is one of the tragedies of our time, I call it resignation viewing. In other words, there's nothing else to do but.
Yeah.
I might have homework. I might have people I need to call on. I might have friends and family that need help. I might have an art form and an athletic, you know, responsibility and skill that I want to refine. But right now, I want to be involved in my screen. It's called resignation viewing. And I tell my students, look, if you find yourself saying I have nothing else to do too often, there's something wrong. It's a reminder of that image, that parable of Jesus in Matthew 20, where, you know, the people standing around all day because no one has hired us. And then what I also say on regards to reward viewing, relief viewing, resignation viewing, being able to identify what is the trigger, what is the self-justification. And by the way, self-justifications are what the prophets always confronted, and that's what got them killed. Is because they attacked the self-justifications of empires, of emperors, of whatever the socioeconomic class. But our viewing habits, whatever the self-justification, reward viewing, relief viewing, resignation viewing, naturally become a ritual. William James said, look at who we are is essentially made up of habits. And of course, William James died in 1910. This was, a telephone was there, and the radio was a decade away. Television was a generation away. But finding what are the rationales for our rituals.
And I think that, you brought up the Old Testament prophets, and from a Christian standpoint, of course, we await the world to come when the kingdom of God is fully realized. But the prophets are continually telling us what we do in this life matters. Yeah. It's significant. And I think your book is a reminder of that. And one of the realities in our life is pop culture, and our engagement with that does matter, and our decisions there. So you've provided us with a diagnosis, but also a roadmap to health. And I wonder, as we kind of bring it to a close, are there questions that folks would like to raise, comments?
And thanks for coming.
Thank you. And I will say that if there are questions that come up, you can always email me and I'll forward them to Paul. My email is tholsing@arbor.edu.
Paul?
Yeah. Hey, Chuck, blessings on you.
I don't have so much of a question as a commendation that some books, the author just says what he thinks. You write what you live. And it's so good. It's such a validation.
Yeah.
And
thank you, brother.
Everybody knows it, and you do not hide your light under a bushel. I mean, you're not ostentatious about it, but everybody knows, and we all just thank God for who you are and what you've done for us.
Thank you, brother. Thank you, brother. Thank you, Chuck. Love you a lot, man.
Anybody else? Or Paul, any last words before we close here today?
Let me just try and read this. I meant to, it was the metaphor, the junk food metaphor.
Yeah.
I'll leave you with this. Suppose a food item, and I can send this to anyone who wants it, but suppose a food item, junk food as well as healthy, was as easily accessible as the push of a button on a laptop computer. Imagine that merely thinking about a cupcake, make that 2 cupcakes, creme brulee, or 2 stalks of cooked buttered asparagus for a few seconds. Settling in on your desire to wolf them down would make it immediately available. Imagine that it is a magic that is at your fingertips every day, all day. Now, this is beyond our saunter to the refrigerator, opening the door and hoping to find some transcendent snack experience. The magic does not even make anyone get off the couch. And then everyone is commanded to eat sensible portions, maintain a balanced diet, and cut down on sugars and carbs. What would we look like, Spring Arbor? And how resentful would we be toward the diet police? Now, suppose any photo, film scene, video sensation, gratuitously sensual, graphically violent, or aesthetically brilliant and redemptively haunting was as accessible as the push of a button. Imagine that merely thinking about it launched a series of searches that delivered the visual package in seconds. And then someone brings up the Savior who sagely offered this cryptic little gem. The lamp of the body is the eye, and whoever looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. Of course, what I'm describing is no longer magic, but the sometimes bludgeoning reality of our media-saturated existence. Is the lamp of our body full of light or full of darkness or somewhere stigmatized in the middle? And with visual stimulus so easily accessible, how much easier is it to conveniently marginalize the man from Galilee, who sometimes happens to be as far away as you can get from the entertainment anarchy loosed upon the earth? For many of us, such easily accessible visual magic describes the lamp of the body dilemma and the crux of our mass-mediated dance. And in contrast to bathroom scales and mirrors that would gag us with the shocking results of regularly indulgent food binges, the scales and mirrors that measure our soul's health is not so readily available.
Thank you, Paul. For leaving us with that, and for, the way you live your life. And honestly, I can just imagine a tremendous amount of work and study, a lifetime that has gone into this. So I want to thank you for being with us today, and also for providing this to the church, to our students, to all of us who need that word. So
Thanks, Tom. And thanks to all of you, to the institution that I adore, that I love, that changed my life. Thanks be to God.
All right. And thanks for everybody for joining us. And we'll see you next month for Community of Learners. Bye-bye.
Sounds good. Blessings.